The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty town square of Cedar Ridge, Texas, as Martha Sullivan stood with her chin raised high despite the chains around her wrists. Her auburn hair, once carefully pinned in the fashion of a proper lady, now hung loose around her shoulders, framing a face that bore the marks of recent hardship but not defeat. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the gathered crowd, but Martha's green eyes remained fixed on the horizon, refusing to acknowledge the spectacle being made of her life. "What we have here, gentlemen, is a fine specimen of womanhood," the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of a man who had sold everything from livestock to land. "Mrs. Martha Sullivan, widow of the late Captain James Sullivan, killed in action at Shiloh. She's strong, can read and write, and knows her way around a household." Martha's jaw tightened at the mention of James. Her husband had died 2 years ago, leaving her with nothing but debts and a small homestead that the bank had claimed within months. The war had taken so much from so many, but, for Martha, it had taken everything that mattered. When the creditors came calling and she couldn't pay, they'd found an old law that allowed them to sell her into indentured servitude to settle her husband's gambling debts she'd never known existed until after his death. The crowd before her was a mixture of local farmers, merchants, and drifters. Some looked at her with pity, others with calculation. A few younger men whistled and made crude comments that made her stomach turn. But Martha kept her gaze steady, her back straight. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. "Bidding starts at $50, the auctioneer announced. "55, called out Jeremiah Hutchins, the blacksmith whose wife had died in childbirth the previous winter. He was a decent man, Martha knew, but the thought of being bound to anyone, even someone kind, made her feel sick. "60. This from Tom Bradley, who owned the general store. His eyes held a hunger that made Martha's skin crawl. The bidding continued, climbing slowly. Martha tried to block out the voices, the way they discussed her as if she were a horse being sold. Instead, she thought of James, of their brief happy years together before the war came. She thought of the small cabin they'd shared, the garden she'd tended, the dreams they'd had for children and a peaceful future. $75. Bradley called again, and Martha saw the satisfaction in his eyes. Few men in Cedar Ridge had that kind of money to spare. That's when she noticed him. Standing at the back of the crowd, partially hidden in the shadow of the general store, was a man unlike the others. He was tall and lean, with dark skin and long black hair that he wore in a single braid down his back. His clothes were a mixture of traditional Native American garb and practical frontier wear: buckskin pants, a cotton shirt, and a leather vest decorated with intricate beadwork. A rifle was slung across his back, and a knife hung at his side. He watched the proceedings with dark, intelligent eyes, his face giving away nothing of his thoughts. Martha had heard whispers about the Choctaw hunter who sometimes came to town to trade pelts and meat for supplies. The townspeople tolerated him because he caused no trouble and his goods were always of high quality, but she'd never seen him before. Going once at $75, the auctioneer called. The Choctaw man stepped forward, his movement fluid and silent despite his size. $3, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the now quiet square. Laughter erupted from the crowd. Bradley shook his head in amusement. "You can't be serious, Indian." "I bid 75. But the auctioneer was frowning, shuffling through papers on his podium. "Actually, gentlemen, there's something I need to clarify. The debt in question is specifically for $3.47 in unpaid gambling losses to a Cherokee gambler named Joseph Ridge. According to the law, the minimum bid must match the debt amount." The crowd's laughter died away as the implications sank in. Bradley's face flushed red. "That's absurd. The woman's worth far more than $3. "Be that as it may," the auctioneer said uncomfortably, "the law is clear. The debt is $3.47. Do I hear $3.50? Bradley looked around frantically. $4. The Choctaw man raised his hand slightly. $3.50. $5. Bradley countered, his voice rising. $3.51, the hunter said calmly. The bidding became a farce as Bradley tried to raise the stakes while the Choctaw man methodically outbid him by a single cent each time. The crowd grew restless, some laughing, others grumbling about the waste of time. Finally, Bradley threw up his hands in disgust. "This is ridiculous. I'm not going to stand here and argue over pennies with a savage." The word savage hung in the air like a curse. The Choctaw man's expression didn't change, but Martha saw something flicker in his dark eyes, not anger, but something deeper and more dangerous. Going once, the auctioneer called nervously. Going twice. "Wait." Martha's voice rang out across the square, clear and strong. The crowd fell silent, turning to stare at her. She had spoken for the first time since being brought to the auction block. "I want to speak," she continued, her green eyes blazing. "Before you sell me like a piece of property, I want to say something." The auctioneer looked uncertain. "Ma'am, that's not really how let her speak," someone called from the crowd. Others took up the cry, curious to hear what the proud widow had to say. Martha turned to face the gathering, her chains clinking softly. When she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the square. "You all knew my husband. Captain James Sullivan fought and died for this country, for the idea that all men are created equal and deserve to be free. Yet here you stand, watching me be sold like a slave because of debts I never made, choices I never had a hand in." Her eyes found Bradley in the crowd. "Some of you look at me with hunger, thinking you can buy not just my labor but my dignity. Others look at me with pity, as if I'm a helpless creature who needs saving." Then, her gaze moved to the Choctaw hunter. "And one of you sees an opportunity to purchase something for almost nothing, perhaps thinking I'll be grateful for the small mercy." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "But I want you all to understand something. I am Martha Sullivan, daughter of pioneers, wife of a war hero, and a free woman in my heart no matter what chains you put on my body. Whoever buys me today is not purchasing my submission. They are not buying my gratitude or my compliance." Her voice rose, carrying passion and fury in equal measure. "You'll regret this decision. I will never kneel to any master. I will work because the law says I must, but I will never bow my head or break my spirit. I will be a constant reminder of the injustice done here today, and I swear to you that whoever claims ownership of me will rue the day they raised their hand." The square had gone completely silent. Even the horses seemed to have stopped moving. Martha's words hung in the air like a challenge, a promise, and a threat all rolled into one. The auctioneer cleared his throat nervously. "Well, thank you for that, ma'am. Very spirited. Now, do I hear any other bids?" The crowd shuffled uncomfortably. Bradley was staring at Martha with a mixture of anger and something that might have been respect. Other potential bidders seemed to have lost their enthusiasm. $3.51, the Choctaw hunter repeated quietly. Going once, the auctioneer called. Going twice. Sold. To the, He paused, realizing he didn't know the buyer's name. "Joseph Crowfeather," the hunter said, stepping forward. As the auctioneer completed the paperwork, Joseph Crowfeather approached Martha. Up close, she could see that he was perhaps 30 years old, with strong, weathered features and scars on his hands that spoke of a life spent in the wilderness. His dark eyes met hers steadily. "Your words were brave," he said quietly, his English clear but carrying the slight accent of someone for whom it wasn't his first language. "But perhaps not wise." "Wisdom is a luxury I can no longer afford," Martha replied, lifting her chin. "I spoke the truth. Truth can be dangerous. So can silence." Joseph studied her for a long moment, then reached into his pocket and produced a small key. "Turn around," he said. Martha hesitated, then turned her back to him. She felt his fingers, gentle but sure, as he unlocked the shackles around her wrists. The chains fell away, clanking onto the wooden platform. "What are you doing?" she asked, turning back to face him. "What needs to be done," he said simply. "You are free to go." The crowd murmured in surprise and confusion. Bradley pushed forward. "Now wait just a minute." You bought her fair and square. You can't just. I paid the debt, Joseph said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made Bradley take a step back. The debt is settled. She owes nothing more. But the indenture papers will not be signed. Joseph's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his knife. The woman is free. Martha stared at him in shock. I don't understand. Why would you? Because, Joseph said, shouldering his rifle, no one should be sold for the price of a loaf of bread. Because your husband died fighting for freedom, and that should mean something. And because. He paused, his dark eyes meeting hers again. Because I know what it means to be treated as less than human. The crowd was growing restless, voices rising as people argued about the legality and precedent of what had just happened. The auctioneer was frantically shuffling papers, clearly out of his depth. You should go, Joseph said to Martha. Before they decide to find another way to keep you here. Martha looked around at the hostile faces surrounding them. Some people seemed angry that their entertainment had been cut short. Others appeared confused by the turn of events. Bradley was arguing loudly with the auctioneer, demanding that something be done. Where am I supposed to go? Martha asked. I have nothing. No money, no home, no family. That is not my concern, Joseph said, but there was no cruelty in his voice. You wanted freedom. You have it. What you do with it is your choice. He turned to leave, but Martha caught his arm. Wait. Her touch was light, but it stopped him. At least tell me why. The real reason. Joseph was quiet for so long that Martha thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because 20 years ago, I watched my sister sold at an auction much like this one. She was taken from our people during a raid, kept as a slave for 3 years before they decided to sell her again. I was just a boy then, too young and too weak to do anything but watch. Martha felt her breath catch. What happened to her? I never saw her again. Joseph's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. So when I see another woman in chains, speaking words of defiance, I do what I could not do then. Before Martha could respond, a commotion erupted behind them. Bradley had convinced several other men to join him, and they were approaching with determined looks on their faces. That Indian thinks he can make a mockery of our laws, Bradley was saying loudly. This is still America, and we don't let savages decide how we do business. Joseph's entire demeanor changed. The quiet, almost gentle man who had been speaking to Martha disappeared, replaced by something harder and infinitely more dangerous. His hand moved to rest on the handle of his knife. Walk away, he said to Bradley, his voice carrying the quiet menace of a predator. I'm not taking orders from you, Bradley sneered. You think because you paid $3 you can waltz in here, and he never finished the sentence. Joseph moved with fluid grace, stepping forward and placing the tip of his knife against Bradley's throat so quickly that most people didn't even see the blade clear its sheath. I said walk away, Joseph repeated, his voice deadly calm. The square went dead silent. Bradley's eyes were wide with shock and fear, a thin line of blood appearing where the knife pressed against his skin. The other men who had been with him stepped back uncertainly. You're making a mistake, Indian, Bradley managed to gasp. The only mistake, Joseph said quietly, would be thinking that I won't cut your throat if you don't leave this woman alone. For a moment, the tableau held, Joseph poised like a coiled spring, Bradley frozen in terror, Martha standing behind them with her heart pounding, and the crowd watching in fascinated horror. Then, Joseph stepped back, the knife disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Bradley stumbled backward, his hand going to his throat. This isn't over, Bradley snarled, but he was already backing away. Yes, Joseph said quietly. It is. As Bradley and his companions retreated, grumbling threats and curses, Joseph turned back to Martha. She was staring at him with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. You could have killed him, she said. Yes. Why didn't you? Joseph considered the question. Because killing should be a last resort, not a first response. And because He paused, looking around at the dispersing crowd. Because there has been enough violence in this land. Too much blood has been spilled already. Martha nodded slowly, understanding more than he had said. Thank you, she said quietly. For what you did. For giving me back my freedom. Use it well, Joseph said. Then, he turned and began walking away. Where are you going? Martha called after him. Home, he replied without turning around. Where is home? This time he did stop and turn back. Wherever I choose to make it. Martha watched him disappear into the crowd, still trying to process everything that had happened. In the space of an hour, she had gone from being sold into slavery to being free again, all because a Choctaw hunter had paid $3.51 for her freedom and then given it back. She looked around the square, realizing that she was truly alone now. Joseph was right, she was free, but she had nowhere to go and no way to survive. The townspeople were still staring at her with a mixture of curiosity and hostility. She had made enemies today with her defiant words, and she doubted anyone would be willing to help her now. But, as she stood there in the morning sun, feeling the weight of the chains gone from her wrists, Martha Sullivan made a decision. She would survive. She would find a way to build a new life from nothing, just as her parents had done when they came west. And, someday, somehow, she would repay the debt she owed to the man who had given her the chance to try. The auctioneer was packing up his papers, the crowd was dispersing, and the normal business of the day was resuming. But Martha knew that everything had changed. Not just for her, but for the strange, quiet hunter who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she hadn't even known she was praying. As she walked away from the auction block for the last time, Martha couldn't shake the feeling that her story with Joseph Crowfeather was far from over. In fact, she had the distinct impression that it had only just begun. 3 days after the auction, Martha Sullivan stood at the edge of Cedar Ridge with everything she owned tied in a small bundle, a spare dress, a few personal items that had somehow escaped her creditors, and $2 she had earned helping the doctor's wife with laundry. The morning was crisp, and frost still clung to the grass along the roadside. She had nowhere to go, but staying in town was impossible. Too many people looked at her now with either hostility or speculation about what a woman alone might be willing to do for money or shelter. She was considering her limited options when she heard the soft sound of hoofbeats on the dirt road behind her. Turning, she saw Joseph Crowfeather approaching on a paint horse, leading a pack animal behind him. He rode with the easy grace of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle, and, when he saw her, he slowed his horse to a walk. "You are leaving," he observed, bringing his mount to a stop a few feet away. "There's nothing left for me here," Martha replied, adjusting her grip on her bundle. "I thought I might try to reach San Antonio. Perhaps find work there." Joseph studied her for a moment, taking in her worn dress, her thin shoes, and the determined set of her shoulders. "It is a long walk to San Antonio. 3 days, maybe 4 for someone on foot. And the road is not safe for a woman traveling alone." "I'll manage," Martha said, though she knew he was right. She had heard stories of bandits and worse things that prowled the roads between towns. "You could die," Joseph said matter-of-factly. "I could die here just as easily," Martha countered. "At least on the road, I'll die free." Something flickered in Joseph's dark eyes, perhaps approval, perhaps understanding. He was quiet for a long moment, then dismounted from his horse with fluid grace. "I am traveling south myself," he said, checking the leather straps on his pack horse. "Following the game trails toward the Guadalupe River. It would be practical to have someone to share the watch at night." Martha stared at him, unsure she had heard correctly. "Are you offering me traveling companionship?" "I am offering a business arrangement," Joseph corrected. "You know how to cook over an open fire?" "Of course." "Can you tend wounds? Clean game?" "I've done both." Joseph nodded as if he had expected as much. "Then, you could be useful. In return, I would provide protection and guidance. When we reach a settlement where you might find honest work, we part ways." Martha felt a flutter of hope, followed immediately by suspicion. "What's the real reason?" she asked. "You've already done more than enough by freeing me. Why help me again? Joseph was quiet for so long that Martha thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. Because leaving you here would be the same as killing you slowly instead of quickly. And, because. He paused, seeming to weigh his words. Because I know what it is to be alone in a world that sees you as less than human. The honesty in his voice made Martha's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. She had been so focused on survival that she had almost forgotten what kindness looked like. All right, she said quietly. I accept your offer. Joseph nodded and reached into one of his packs, withdrawing a pair of worn but sturdy moccasins. Your shoes will not last a day on the trail, he said, holding them out to her. These belonged to my sister. They should fit. Martha took the moccasins, feeling the soft leather, still supple despite their age. I can't take something that belonged to her. She has no use for them now, Joseph said simply. And she would have wanted them to help another woman in need. As Martha changed into the moccasins, which fit remarkably well, Joseph efficiently reorganized his pack to make room for her small bundle of possessions. She watched him work, noting the methodical way he checked and double-checked every strap and tie. You've done this before, she observed. Helped someone escape, I mean. Joseph glanced up at her, then returned to his work. Not escape. But I have guided people who needed to disappear for a while. Runaway slaves heading north, sometimes. A few white settlers who had made enemies of the wrong people. The wilderness does not care about the color of your skin or the mistakes you have made. And what about you? Martha asked. What are you running from? This time Joseph's hands stilled completely. When he looked at her, his dark eyes held depths of pain that made her regret the question. I am not running, he said quietly. I am searching. Before Martha could ask what he was searching for, Joseph swung back up onto his horse and offered her his hand. You can ride behind me for the first few miles, until your feet adjust to the moccasins. After that, we walk together. Martha hesitated for only a moment before accepting his help up onto the horse. She had to sit very close to him, one hand resting lightly on his shoulder for balance, and she was acutely aware of his warmth and the steady rhythm of his breathing. As they rode south out of Cedar Ridge, Martha watched the familiar buildings disappear behind them. She felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration at leaving the only life she had ever known, even a life that had become impossible to bear. Tell me about where we're going, she said as the town faded from view. The Guadalupe River country, Joseph replied. Good hunting, clean water, and few settlements. I have a winter camp there where I cure hides and prepare for the trading season. You live alone out there? Mostly. Sometimes other hunters pass through. Occasionally, travelers who need shelter for a night or two. Martha could hear the unspoken message in his words. She would be one of those temporary visitors, welcome for a time but not expected to stay. It should have worried her, but instead she felt oddly relieved. She had been dependent on others for too long, first on her husband, then on the mercy of creditors and auctioneers. The idea of a temporary arrangement, clearly defined and honestly stated, was refreshing. They traveled in comfortable silence for the first hour, following a well-worn path that led away from the main roads. The countryside around Cedar Ridge gave way to rolling hills covered in oak and mesquite. Martha found herself relaxing despite the uncertainty of her situation. The horse's steady gait was soothing, and Joseph's presence behind her was reassuring without being presumptuous. When they stopped at midday beside a small creek, Joseph helped her down from the horse and began to unpack supplies for a simple meal. Martha watched him work for a few minutes, then moved to help without being asked. You said you were searching for something, she said as they ate jerky and hardtack beside the creek. May I ask what? Joseph was quiet for a long moment, staring into the clear water. Information, he said finally. About what happened to my people during the removal. Martha felt her stomach tighten. She had heard stories about the forced relocation of native tribes, though the details were often vague or contradictory. You mean when the Choctaw were moved to Indian Territory? Some were moved, Joseph said, his voice carefully controlled. Others simply disappeared. My family was separated during the chaos. My sister was taken, as I told you. My parents and younger brother were supposed to be on a transport to the new territory, but they never arrived. You think they're still alive? I think someone knows what happened to them, even if they are not. Joseph's hands clenched slightly around his food. There were men who made money from the removal, contractors who were paid to transport families, officials who sold supplies that never reached their destination. Some of those men are still alive, still living comfortable lives built on the suffering of others. Martha heard the controlled rage in his voice and understood suddenly why he lived alone in the wilderness, why he had intervened at the auction, why he seemed to carry such a deep well of pain behind his quiet demeanor. "Is that why you helped me?" she asked gently. "Because you're looking for justice for your own family?" Joseph considered her question seriously. "Perhaps partly," he admitted. "But also because justice delayed too long becomes revenge, and revenge makes a man into something he should not be. Helping you, it reminds me that there is still good to be done in the world." They finished their meal in thoughtful silence, each lost in their own reflections. When they resumed traveling, Joseph allowed Martha to walk beside his horse rather than ride. The moccasins he had given her were indeed comfortable, and she found that she could keep pace with his leisurely gait without difficulty. As the afternoon wore on, Joseph began to point out various landmarks and signs, animal tracks in the soft earth, the way certain plants indicated water nearby, how to tell which direction they were traveling by the position of the sun and the shape of the hills. "Why are you teaching me this?" Martha asked after he had shown her how to identify an edible root. "Because knowledge is the only thing that cannot be taken from you," Joseph replied. "Property can be seized, money can be stolen, even people can be sold. But what you know, what you have learned to do with your own hands and mind, that stays with you no matter what happens." Martha absorbed this wisdom as they walked, trying to memorize everything he showed her. She had always been quick to learn, and she found that the skills Joseph was teaching her came naturally. Perhaps it was because her own grandparents had been pioneers, or perhaps it was simply that desperation was an excellent teacher. As the sun began to set, they made camp in a small grove of trees beside another creek. Joseph showed Martha how to build a fire that would provide warmth and light without creating too much smoke, how to arrange their sleeping area for maximum comfort and security, how to position their packs and equipment for quick access if needed. "Do you expect trouble?" Martha asked, noting how carefully he had placed his rifle and knife within easy reach. "I always expect trouble," Joseph replied. "That is how I have stayed alive this long. But I do not fear it. Fear makes you weak and stupid. Caution makes you strong and wise." As they sat by the fire eating a dinner of freshly caught fish and wild greens, Martha found herself studying her unexpected companion. In the firelight, his strong features were softened, and she could see traces of the boy he must have once been before tragedy had hardened him into the man he was now. "May I ask you something personal?" she said. Joseph looked up from tending the fire. "You may ask. I may not answer. How old were you when your family was taken?" 10, Joseph replied without hesitation. "Old enough to remember everything, too young to do anything about it." "And you've been searching for them ever since?" "Not at first. At first, I was just trying to survive. I lived with different families, learned to hunt and track, became useful enough that people were willing to feed me. It was only when I became a man that I began to actively search for answers." Martha could imagine the lonely, determined child he must have been, learning to be valuable to others because he had no other way to secure his place in the world. No wonder he seemed so self-sufficient, so careful about forming attachments. "Have you found any answers at all?" she asked gently. Joseph stared into the fire for a long moment. "A few," he said finally. "I know that the transport my family was supposed to be on never reached Indian territory. I know that the man who was contracted to provide it, a man named William Morrison, claimed that they were attacked by bandits and everyone was killed. But you don't believe that. Morrison was known to be corrupt. He had deals with slave traders, selling strong young men and women who were supposed to be relocating. I think my family was sold, just like you were sold, except that no one came to free them." The pain in his voice was carefully controlled, but Martha could hear it clearly. She understood now why he had been so immediately moved to action at the auction, why he had been willing to risk violence to prevent her from falling into the wrong hands. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "For your loss, and for the injustice of it." Joseph nodded acknowledgement of her sympathy. The past cannot be changed. But, perhaps the future can be influenced by the choices we make today. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn down to glowing coals. Martha felt safer than she had in months, despite being alone in the wilderness with a man she barely knew. There was something about Joseph's quiet strength, his obvious competence, that made her feel protected rather than threatened. "What will you do," she asked eventually, "when we reach your winter camp?" "Prepare for winter. Hunt and trap, cure hides, make the things I will need for spring trading. And continue to gather information about Morrison and men like him." "And what should I do? I mean, how can I be useful to you in return for shelter and protection?" Joseph looked at her across the fire, his dark eyes reflecting the flames. "Learn," he said simply. "Learn everything you can about surviving in this country. Learn to hunt, to track, to read the weather and the land. Learn to defend yourself." "You would teach me all that?" "If you are willing to learn. Winter is long, and there is time for teaching. By spring, you will be able to take care of yourself no matter where you choose to go." Martha felt a flutter of excitement at the prospect. The idea of becoming truly self-sufficient, of never again being dependent on the whims of others, was incredibly appealing. "I would like that very much," she said. Joseph nodded as if her answer had been expected. "Then, we have an agreement. I will teach you what I know, you will help with the work of surviving the winter, and, in the spring, you will be free to make your own choices about your future." As they prepared for sleep, Joseph showed Martha how to arrange her blankets for maximum warmth and how to keep her knife within easy reach. He positioned himself between her and the open side of their small camp, she noticed, placing himself as the first line of defense against any potential threat. "Thank you," Martha said quietly as they settled in for the night. "For all of this. I know you didn't have to help me." "No," Joseph agreed. "I did not have to. But, sometimes the things we choose to do are more important than the things we are required to do." As Martha drifted off to sleep beside the dying fire, she reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. 3 days ago, she had been sold at auction like a piece of property. Now she was traveling through the wilderness with a Choctaw hunter who was teaching her to be free in ways she had never imagined possible. She didn't know what the future would bring, but, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was looking forward to finding out. 2 months into their unlikely partnership, Martha had learned to move through the forest as silently as smoke. She crouched motionless behind a fallen log, watching a white-tailed deer pick its way delicately through the underbrush 30 yards away. Her breathing was controlled and, even, her body perfectly still despite the cramped position she had held for nearly 20 minutes. The bow in her hands, a gift from Joseph when she had proven her dedication to learning, was drawn and ready. The deer, a young doe, paused to nibble at some tender shoots. Martha shifted her weight almost imperceptibly, adjusting her aim. Joseph had taught her to be patient, to wait for the perfect moment rather than rushing and missing her opportunity. She could hear his voice in her mind: "The forest will teach you everything you need to know, but only if you are quiet enough to listen." The doe took another step, presenting a clear shot at her vital organs. Martha drew in a slow breath, held it, and released the arrow. It flew true, taking the deer cleanly through the heart. The animal bounded once, then collapsed, dead before she could suffer. Martha remained motionless for several more minutes, listening to the forest sounds resume around her. Only when she was certain that her shot had not attracted any unwanted attention did she rise and move toward her kill. Joseph had taught her that as well: always be aware of who else might be watching, always be ready to flee or fight. As she knelt beside the doe to begin the process of field dressing, Martha reflected on how much her life had changed since that day at the auction block. The frightened, desperate woman who had been sold for $3 no longer existed. In her place was someone harder, more capable, more dangerous than she had ever imagined she could be. Joseph's winter camp was hidden in a narrow canyon along the Guadalupe River, sheltered by towering limestone cliffs and accessible only through a concealed passage that looked like nothing more than a crack in the rock. The camp itself was a marvel of practical efficiency, a sturdy cabin built against the canyon wall, with a workshop for tanning hides, a smokehouse for preserving meat, and even a small corral for horses. "How long have you been building this place?" Martha had asked when they first arrived. 5 years, Joseph had replied. "A little more each season. It is good to have a place where you can disappear completely when the world becomes too much to bear." Martha had come to understand what he meant. The canyon was like stepping out of the world entirely. No sounds of civilization penetrated the rocky walls, no smoke from their fires could be seen from outside, and the narrow entrance could be easily defended by one person with a rifle. It was a perfect sanctuary for someone who had learned to trust no one. Over the long winter months, Joseph had been true to his word about teaching her everything he knew. Martha had learned to track animals by their footprints, their scent, their droppings, and the subtle signs they left as they moved through the landscape. She had learned to identify dozens of edible and medicinal plants, how to find water in seemingly barren country, how to predict weather changes by watching the behavior of birds and the color of the sky. More importantly, perhaps, she had learned to fight. A woman alone in this country needs more than just survival skills, Joseph had told her during their first week in the canyon. She needs to be able to kill anyone who tries to take from her what is not freely given. He had started by teaching her to use a knife not just for cutting and skinning, but as a weapon. Martha had been shocked by her own aptitude for violence. Perhaps it was the rage she still carried over what had been done to her, or perhaps it was simply that survival brought out capabilities she had never known she possessed. Either way, she had learned quickly and, well. The bow had come later, after she had proven her commitment to mastering the knife. Joseph had made it himself from seasoned oak, and had spent weeks teaching her the proper stance, the correct draw, the way to breathe and aim and release. Now, after months of practice, Martha could put an arrow exactly where she wanted it at 50 yards. But it was the rifle training that had surprised her most. Joseph owned 3 firearms, a hunting rifle, a shorter carbine for close work, and a pistol that he wore at his side. He had been reluctant at first to teach her to use them. "Guns are loud," he had explained. "They draw attention. And they can fail you when you need them most. A knife or a bow will never misfire or run out of ammunition." But Martha had insisted, and eventually Joseph had relented. She had proven to be an excellent shot with all 3 weapons, steady-handed and accurate even under pressure. Joseph had tested her by having her shoot at targets while he shouted at her, threw things near her feet, even fired his own weapon close to her ear without warning. Through it all, Martha had remained calm and focused. "You have warrior's blood," he had told her after one particularly challenging session. "Most people panic when violence comes close to them. You become more dangerous." It was true, Martha had realized. The more chaotic and threatening a situation became, the clearer her thinking seemed to get. She had discovered that she possessed a cold, calculating ruthlessness that probably should have frightened her but instead made her feel powerful for the first time in her life. Now, as she finished field dressing the deer and began the process of transporting the meat back to camp, Martha found herself thinking about what would happen when spring came. Joseph had made it clear from the beginning that their arrangement was temporary, but, as the weeks had passed, neither of them had spoken about her eventual departure. The truth was, Martha wasn't sure she wanted to leave. Life in the canyon was hard but satisfying in a way that her previous existence had never been. Every day brought new challenges and new learning opportunities. She felt stronger, more competent, more truly alive than she ever had as a conventional married woman in a civilized town. But she also understood that she couldn't stay forever. Joseph valued his solitude too much to accept a permanent companion, no matter how useful she might be. And Martha herself was not sure she was ready to commit to a life of complete isolation from the world. As she made her way back through the forest toward the canyon, Martha heard the sound of approaching horses. She immediately faded into the underbrush, her hand moving instinctively to the knife at her side. Joseph had taught her that visitors to their hidden sanctuary were almost never good news. Peering through the leaves, Martha saw 3 men on horseback following the game trail that led toward the canyon entrance. They were well armed and had the hard, watchful look of men accustomed to violence. One of them, riding slightly ahead of the others, was someone she recognized with a shock of surprise and anger. Tom Bradley, the store owner from Cedar Ridge who had tried to buy her at the auction. Martha's mind raced as she watched the three men disappear toward the canyon. Bradley's presence here could not be a coincidence. Someone must have told him about Joseph's winter camp, but who? And, more importantly, why had he come? Moving as quickly as she dared while still maintaining silence, Martha made her way back toward the camp. She had to warn Joseph, but she also had to be careful not to walk into an ambush herself. If Bradley and his companions had hostile intentions, they might have already positioned themselves to control the canyon entrance. As she approached the concealed passage that led into the canyon, Martha could hear voices echoing off the rock walls. She left her deer carcass hidden in the brush and climbed up onto a ledge that Joseph had shown her, a position that allowed someone to observe the camp while remaining invisible from below. What she saw made her blood run cold. Joseph was standing in front of the cabin with his hands raised, his weapons conspicuously absent. Bradley and one of his companions had their guns drawn and pointed at him, while the third man was rifling through Joseph's belongings. "I told you we'd find you eventually, Indian," Bradley was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the enclosed space. "Did you really think you could humiliate me in front of the whole town and just disappear into the wilderness?" "I have no quarrel with you," Joseph replied, his voice calm despite the weapons trained on him. "What happened in Cedar Ridge was finished when I paid the debt." "Oh, it was finished for you, maybe," Bradley sneered. "But not for me. Do you have any idea how much business I lost after that little stunt of yours? People started asking questions about my other dealings, started wondering if maybe I wasn't as honest as they thought." Martha could see the tension in Joseph's shoulders, the way he was calculating distances and angles even with his hands in the air. She knew he was looking for an opportunity to fight back, but 2 guns against an unarmed man were bad odds even for someone as skilled as Joseph. The third man, who had been searching through Joseph's possessions, suddenly straightened up with something in his hands. "Hey, Bradley, look at this," he called out, holding up a leather pouch. Bradley moved closer to examine the find while keeping his gun trained on Joseph. Well, he said with satisfaction. "Looks like our Indian friend has been doing quite well for himself. Must be $200 in gold and silver here." "Money I earned honestly through hunting and trading," Joseph said. "Maybe so, but not anymore." Bradley gestured to his companion. "Tie him up, Jake. We'll take everything worth taking, then decide what to do with him." Martha watched Jake holster his gun and approach Joseph with a length of rope. This was her chance, with only one gun still drawn, the odds were much more manageable. She eased her rifle into position, taking careful aim at Bradley's center of mass. But, before she could fire, Joseph made his move. As Jake reached for his wrists, Joseph suddenly spun and grabbed the man's gun hand, twisting violently. Jake cried out in pain and surprise as his wrist broke with an audible crack. Joseph stripped the weapon from his grasp and used Jake's body as a shield while he dove for cover behind a pile of firewood. Bradley cursed and opened fire, but his shots went wide as Joseph rolled and came up with Jake's pistol in his hand. The third man, caught completely off guard, was scrambling for his own weapon when Joseph put a bullet through his shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. Bradley, realizing that the situation had turned against him, began backing toward the canyon entrance while continuing to fire wildly. Joseph, protected by the firewood, was methodically returning accurate shots that forced Bradley to keep moving. That was when Martha made her presence known. "Drop your gun, Bradley," she called out, her rifle trained on him from her elevated position. "You're surrounded." Bradley spun toward the sound of her voice, his face going white with shock when he saw her. "You? But you're supposed to be dead? Sold into slavery? Broken and helpless?" Martha's voice was cold as winter wind. "Sorry to disappoint you." For a moment, Bradley seemed frozen by indecision. Then, perhaps realizing that his position was hopeless, he raised his gun toward Martha. He never got the chance to fire. Joseph's shot took him through the heart, dropping him instantly. The man Martha had wounded was trying to crawl toward his fallen weapon, but Joseph was already moving to disarm him. "Stay down," Joseph commanded, kicking the gun away. "Move again and you'll join your friends." Martha climbed down from her perch and walked over to where Jake was sitting against a rock, cradling his broken wrist. His face was pale with pain and shock. "You're going to answer some questions," she told him, her rifle still ready. "Who told you how to find this place?" Jake looked up at her with frightened eyes. I can't." Martha placed the barrel of her rifle against his good shoulder. "I said you're going to answer questions. I didn't say it would be pleasant." "There was a traitor," Jake gasped. "Name of Morrison. He said there was an Indian hiding out here, someone who might have information he wanted." Martha felt Joseph go very still behind her. She glanced back at him and saw something dangerous flicker in his dark eyes. "William Morrison?" Joseph asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Yeah, that's him. He's been asking around about you for months, offering money for information about where you winter." Joseph moved to stand beside Martha, looking down at their prisoner. "What does Morrison want with me?" "I don't know, I swear. He just said you'd been asking questions about things that were none of your business. Said you needed to be discouraged from asking any more." Martha saw Joseph's hands clench into fists. This was the man he had been searching for, the corrupt contractor who had stolen his family. "Where is Morrison now?" Joseph demanded. "Austin," Jake replied quickly. "He's got a big house there, does business with the government." "Look, I told you what you wanted to know. You gonna let me go?" Joseph looked at Martha, then back at their prisoner. "You're going to deliver a message for me," he said finally. "You're going to tell Morrison that if he wants to find me, he won't have to look very hard. Because I'm coming to Austin, and when I get there, we're going to have a conversation about my family." Jake nodded eagerly, clearly grateful to be escaping with his life. "And, Jake," Martha added, her voice carrying its own quiet threat. "If we see you again, if you come back here or try to cause more trouble, I'll kill you myself. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Jake whispered. "I understand perfectly." After they had sent Jake on his way and dealt with the bodies of his companions, Martha and Joseph sat by their fire, both lost in thought. The attack had changed everything. Their sanctuary had been discovered, their peaceful winter had been shattered, and the past had caught up with them in the form of the man Joseph had been hunting. "You'll have to leave here now," Martha said finally. "Morrison knows where you are, and he'll send more men." "Yes," Joseph agreed. "But not alone." Martha looked at him in surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean that if you're willing, I would like you to come with me to Austin. Morrison is dangerous, and I may need help dealing with him and his men." "You want me to help you get revenge?" Joseph was quiet for a long moment. "Not revenge," he said finally. "Justice. There's a difference." Martha thought about Bradley and his men, about the casual way they had planned to rob and probably kill Joseph. She thought about the auction block, about being sold like property, about all the injustices that seemed to flourish while good people tried to be civilized. "All right," she said. "I'll help you. But on one condition." "What condition?" "When we're finished in Austin, win or lose, we decide what comes next. Not as temporary partners, but as..." She paused, searching for the right words. "As people who have been through something together." Joseph studied her face in the firelight, and, for the first time since she had known him, she saw something that might have been hope in his dark eyes. "Agreed," he said quietly. As they began making plans for their journey to Austin, Martha felt a familiar mixture of fear and exhilaration. She was about to walk into danger again, but this time she would be walking into it as herself, not as someone's property or someone's victim, but as Martha Sullivan, a woman who had learned to be dangerous when the situation demanded it. The war widow who had been sold for $3 was gone forever. In her place was someone stronger, someone who had chosen her own path and made her own alliances. And if William Morrison thought he could intimidate or eliminate them, he was about to learn just how wrong he could be. Austin in the spring of 1867 was a city caught between its frontier past and its aspirations of civilization. Wooden sidewalks and muddy streets were lined with a mixture of rough saloons and elegant mansions, while the state capitol building rose like a beacon of order above the chaos of rapid growth. Martha and Joseph entered the city on a warm April morning, riding side by side on horses they had acquired during their week-long journey south. They had spent the winter months and the early spring planning their approach to William Morrison. Joseph's desire for answers about his family's fate burned as strongly as ever, but their encounter with Bradley's men had taught them both the importance of careful preparation. They were no longer simply hunting for information, they were walking into what was likely to be a war. "There," Joseph said quietly, pointing to a large white house on a hill overlooking the city. "That's Morrison's place." Martha studied the mansion through the morning haze. It was an impressive structure, surrounded by manicured grounds and protected by a wrought iron fence. Several men were visible patrolling the property guards, by their appearance and bearing. "He's expecting trouble," Martha observed. "Good," Joseph replied. "That means he knows why we're here." They had taken rooms at a modest boarding house under assumed names, John and Mary Weatherby, a married couple traveling west to claim land. Martha had braided her distinctive auburn hair and hidden it under a bonnet, while Joseph had traded his traditional clothing for the type of worn but respectable garments worn by settlers and small farmers. To casual observers, they looked like ordinary people, unremarkable and harmless. But their weapons were close at hand, and their eyes never stopped moving, cataloging threats and opportunities wherever they went. Their first stop was the office of the Austin newspaper, where Martha had convinced the editor to let her research back issues in exchange for help with filing and organizing. She was looking for any mention of Morrison or the Indian removal contracts, any hint of the corruption that Joseph was certain existed. What she found was worse than they had expected. "Look at this," she said to Joseph that evening as they sat in their small room, documents spread across the bed between them. "Morrison didn't just steal from relocated families. He was part of a whole network of corruption." The newspaper clippings and government documents Martha had copied told a story of systematic theft and brutality. Morrison and his associates had received millions of dollars in government contracts to transport Native American families to Indian Territory. But many of those transports had never reached their destination. Instead, the families had simply disappeared, while Morrison claimed they had been killed by bandits or had died of disease. "My family was on Transport 23, Joseph said, studying a particular document. According to this, it was attacked by Comanche raiders 50 miles north of Austin. Everyone killed, no survivors." "But, look at this," Martha said, pointing to another paper. Transport 23 was reported attacked on March 15. "But, here's a witness statement from a farmer who saw a wagon train matching that description passing through his area on March 20, 5 days later." Joseph's jaw tightened as he read the witness statement. They were alive after the supposed attack. "And, here," Martha continued, pulling out another document, "is a bill of sale from a slave auction in New Orleans. Lot 47, described as 2 Indian males, ages approximately 45 and 12, strong and healthy. Sold on April 3. The dates matched perfectly. Transport 23 had been attacked on March 15 according to official records, but the survivors had been spotted on March 20 and sold into slavery on April 3. "Your father and brother," Martha said gently. Joseph stared at the papers for a long moment, his hands trembling slightly with controlled rage. "Morrison sold my family into slavery and reported them dead to collect payment for both the transport contract and the death benefits. And he's been doing it for years," Martha added, showing him more documents. "Dozens of families, hundreds of people. All reported dead, all actually sold." That night, as they finalized their plans, Joseph was quieter than usual. Martha could see the weight of the revelation settling on him, not just the confirmation that his family had suffered terribly, but the knowledge that he was not seeking justice for them alone. Hundreds of other families had met the same fate. "We can't just kill him," Joseph said finally. "Not anymore. Too many people need to know the truth about what he's done." "Then, what do you propose?" Joseph looked at the documents spread before them. "We get a confession. On record, in front of witnesses. We make sure the truth comes out.
And how exactly do we do that? Joseph smiled grimly. We give him something he wants more than he wants to keep his secrets.
The next morning, Martha walked alone up the winding path to Morrison's mansion. She wore her finest dress, the one she had been married in, carefully preserved through all her subsequent hardships, and carried herself with the bearing of a lady of quality. When she knocked on the front door, it was opened by a well-dressed Negro servant who looked her up and down with practiced assessment. "I'm here to see Mr. Morrison," Martha announced.
"Tell him that Mrs. James Sullivan has information he's been seeking about a certain Choctaw hunter." The servant disappeared for several minutes, then returned to escort Martha into an elegantly appointed study.
William Morrison was a man in his 50s, well-fed and prosperous-looking, with graying hair and sharp intelligent eyes. He rose from behind a massive oak desk as Martha entered. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said with a slight bow.
"I understand you have information about Joseph Crow Feather."
"I do," Martha replied, settling into the chair he indicated.
"But first, I'd like to understand why you're so interested in him."
Morrison studied her carefully. "Let's just say that Mr. Crow Feather has been asking questions about business matters that don't concern him.
Questions that could be problematic if he continues asking them."
"I see.
"And what would it be worth to you to know where he is and what he's planning?" "That would depend on the quality of the information," Morrison said cautiously. "What exactly is your relationship with this man?"
Martha had prepared for this question. "He's been holding me against my will for the past 6 months," she said, allowing a tremor of fear to enter her voice. "Claiming I owe him some sort of debt for freeing me from an auction. I managed to escape 2 days ago, and I heard in town that you might be interested in information about him." Morrison's eyes lit up with interest.
"Indeed? And what can you tell me about his current location and plans?"
"He's been living in a hidden camp in the hill country, but he's planning to come to Austin within the next few days. He believes you have information about his family, something about Indian removal contracts from years ago."
"His family?" Morrison's expression grew wary. "What exactly does he think I know about his family?"
Martha leaned forward slightly, as if sharing a confidence. "He believes his parents and brother are still alive somewhere, that they were sold into slavery instead of being relocated as they were supposed to be.
He's quite obsessed with the idea." Morrison relaxed slightly.
"Well, he's mistaken, of course. Terrible things happened during the removal, but they were necessary for the greater good.
Many families were lost to disease, attacks, accidents. It was a chaotic time."
"Of course," Martha agreed.
"But he doesn't see it that way."
"He's convinced that you personally were involved in selling his family." "That's absurd," Morrison said, but Martha could see beads of sweat forming on his forehead. "I was simply a contractor, providing transportation services for the government. I had nothing to do with what happened to individual families."
Martha nodded sympathetically. "I'm sure that's true."
"But Joseph is not a rational man about this subject. He's been planning some kind of violent confrontation with you. That's why I decided I had to warn you."
Morrison was quiet for a moment, clearly calculating. "This hidden camp of his, where exactly is it located?"
"In a canyon about a day's ride north of here," Martha replied. "But he won't be there much longer. He's planning to come to Austin and force you to tell him what happened to his family."
"Force me?" "He's become quite violent in recent months. I've seen him kill men without hesitation."
"And he's taught me things," Martha broke off, as if she had said too much.
"Taught you what?" Morrison pressed. "How to use weapons. How to track and hunt."
"He said a woman alone needed to know how to kill anyone who tried to take advantage of her." Martha's voice became smaller, more frightened. "I think he was planning to use me as bait somehow, to get close to you." Morrison leaned back in his chair, a calculating look entering his eyes.
"Mrs. Sullivan, I think you and I might be able to help each other.
I have some business associates who could ensure that Mr. Crow Feather never bothers anyone again."
And, in return, I could make certain that you're properly compensated for your assistance. What kind of compensation? Martha asked. Shall we say $500?
And a letter of recommendation to help you establish yourself wherever you choose to go.
Martha pretended to consider the offer. That's very generous. But I want to be sure I'll be safe from him. Joseph is not the kind of man who gives up easily.
Oh, I can guarantee your safety, Morrison said with confidence. My associates are very thorough in their work.
All right, Martha said finally. But I want the money first.
And I want your promise that when this is over, I'll be free to leave Austin without any further involvement in your affairs.
Of course, Morrison agreed. You seem like a sensible woman, Mrs. Sullivan.
Not like these Indians who can't let go of the past. As Morrison reached into his desk to retrieve the promised money, Martha felt a cold rage building inside her. This man spoke so casually about murder, so dismissively about the families he had destroyed. He saw people as nothing more than commodities to be bought and sold and disposed of when they became inconvenient.
Tell me, Martha said as Morrison counted out the gold coins, what exactly happened to Joseph's family? I mean, what really happened? I promise I won't repeat anything you tell me.
Morrison paused in his counting, looking up at her with surprise.
Why do you want to know? Because if I'm going to help you eliminate him, I want to understand what drove him to this madness. It might help predict what he'll do next.
Morrison considered this, then shrugged.
I suppose it doesn't matter now. His family was supposed to be on one of my transports to Indian Territory.
But they were strong, healthy people. His father was a skilled craftsman, his brother was young and could be trained. There was a market for that kind of labor in the Deep South.
So you sold them?
I provided them with employment opportunities, Morrison corrected.
The official records show they died of fever during transport.
Clean, simple, no loose ends.
And how many other families met the same fate? Morrison smiled coldly. Enough to make me a very wealthy man, Mrs. Sullivan.
The Indian removal was a golden opportunity for those smart enough to see it. The government was paying good money to transport these people, and there were buyers willing to pay even better money for strong workers.
It was simply good business.
Martha felt sick listening to him, but she forced herself to keep asking questions.
Joseph mentioned something about records, documents that might prove what really happened. Do such things exist?
Oh yes, Morrison said with confidence. I kept meticulous records of all my business transactions.
Names, dates, sale prices, delivery locations.
One has to be organized in this type of enterprise. And where do you keep these records? Morrison gestured toward a large safe in the corner of his study. Right here, where they're perfectly secure.
Not that it matters, without corroborating evidence, they're just papers.
And all the witnesses to those transactions are either dead or have excellent reasons to keep quiet. As Martha listened to Morrison's casual confession of mass murder and enslavement, she found herself thinking about Joseph's words from months earlier. Sometimes the things we choose to do are more important than the things we are required to do. She had chosen to stand with Joseph, to help him seek justice for his family and all the others who had suffered at Morrison's hands. And now she was about to make another choice. Mr. Morrison, she said quietly, I need to tell you something.
What's that?
My real name is Martha Sullivan, and I was never Joseph Crowfeather's prisoner.
I'm his partner.
Morrison's face went white with shock and growing fear.
What are you talking about?
I'm talking about the fact that everything you just told me has been heard by witnesses, Martha said, her voice growing stronger.
And that your confession has just sealed your fate.
As if on cue, the study door opened and Joseph entered, followed by two men Martha didn't recognize, one wearing a badge that identified him as a federal marshal, the other carrying what appeared to be a stenographer's pad. William Morrison, the marshal said formally, you're under arrest for fraud, theft of government funds, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping and murder. Morrison lurched to his feet, his hand moving toward the desk drawer, but Joseph was faster. The knife that appeared in the hunter's hand seemed to materialize from thin air, its point coming to rest against Morrison's throat before he could complete his movement.
I wouldn't, Joseph said quietly. I've been waiting 20 years for this moment. Don't give me a reason to end it quickly.
The marshal moved forward with handcuffs while the stenographer continued taking notes. Mr. Morrison, you should know that this entire conversation has been recorded by a witness working under federal authority.
Your confession will be used as evidence in your prosecution. This is entrapment. Morrison sputtered.
You can't. What we can't do, the marshal interrupted, is ignore evidence of systematic murder and enslavement of United States citizens. Thanks to Mrs. Sullivan and Mr. Crowfeather, we now have both documentary evidence and a recorded confession. As Morrison was led away in chains, Martha found herself thinking about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She had started as a victim, been sold like property, learned to be dangerous, and, finally, chosen to fight for something larger than herself.
It's finished, Joseph said quietly as they watched Morrison's carriage disappear down the hill. Yes, Martha agreed. But, what comes next?
Joseph was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the city of Austin spread below them.
I've spent 20 years seeking justice for my family, he said finally. Now that I've found it, I'm not sure what to do with the rest of my life.
Martha slipped her hand into his, feeling the calloused strength of his fingers. Maybe, she said, you could spend it building something instead of hunting for answers to old questions.
What kind of something? A life. A home. A future.
Martha turned to face him fully. I know we said we'd decide what comes next after this was finished.
Well, it's finished. And, I know what I want to come next.
Joseph studied her face, and Martha saw something she had never seen there before, hope mixed with the possibility of happiness.
You want to build something together, he said.
I want to build everything together, Martha replied. I want to go places where no one knows our stories, where we can be whoever we choose to be.
I want to use everything you taught me about surviving to help other people who need it. And, I want to do it all with you.
Joseph was quiet for so long that Martha began to worry she had misread the situation entirely. But, when he finally spoke, his voice was warm with promise. Martha Sullivan, he said, I think that sounds like the beginning of a very good story. As they walked down the hill together, leaving the past behind them and moving toward an uncertain but chosen future, Martha reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. She had been sold at an auction for $3.47, had threatened to never kneel to any master, and had kept that promise in ways she could never have imagined. But, more than that, she had learned that freedom was not something that could be given or taken away by others. It was something that had to be claimed, defended, and shared. And she had found someone who understood that truth as deeply as she did. Behind them, Austin continued its chaotic growth, civilization and wilderness existing in uneasy partnership. Ahead of them, the frontier stretched endlessly, full of opportunities and dangers and possibilities. They rode toward it together, two people who had learned that sometimes the most important choice you can make is who you choose to stand with when the world tries to break you down. And, in choosing each other, they had found something more valuable than freedom itself, they had found home. The war widow who had warned her captors that they would regret their actions had kept her promise in ways that none of them could have anticipated. But, the story that began with defiance and threats had transformed into something larger and more hopeful, a story of justice served, love found, and a future built on the foundation of shared strength and mutual respect. As the sun set behind them and the stars began to appear in the vast Texas sky, Martha and Joseph rode toward whatever adventures awaited them, partners in all things and free in every way that mattered.